Thanks, Hayley. Hi, Tina. Hi, Claire. It might just be the two of you on today because Hayley was saying there's only 3 or 4 booked in anyway, but we're going to record it for anyone else who may have missed it. So, well, we'll just crack on. So my name is Will Ellis. So I work for a company called BW Healthcare Surveyors. If you haven't come across us before, although we may have done work for you both previously anyway. But I'm just going to be going through a bit of a webinar today, just talking about some top tips, I suppose, for GP practice premises, things to be aware of, things that you might not have thought of before, and just some general information about how we might be able to assist you moving forward. So firstly, obviously, thanks to Derby and Derbyshire LMC for putting it together. So thanks, Hayley, for this. But look, let's just crack on. So the presentation itself will probably only take 25-30 minutes. We have assigned an hour for this, but unless either of you have a load of questions at the end, we should finish a little bit early. But if you do have any questions or queries, because there's only 2 of you on here, to be honest with you, just feel free just to interrupt. There's no point waiting until the end. Just interrupt me if you want anything clarifying, or if you've got any questions about a specific slide or something specific that I've talked about, then just give me a shout, no problem at all. Otherwise, if you want to wait to the end, feel free to pop a question in the chat box as well, and we can go through any questions at the end as well. Okay, let's crack on. So in terms of what we were talking about, we'll be talking about very briefly about who we are, BW Healthcare Surveyors. Then we'll be talking about the 2004 premises cost directions. So the changes that were made to the premises cost directions, which was obviously 18 months ago or now. They came out in May 2024. So we'll just go through some of the changes and how we're seeing those changes being dealt with in real life, in real terms, how our clients are seeing those changes and how they might affect you moving forward as well. Then we'll talk very specifically about notional rent. So for those of you who are in an owner-occupied practice, worth listening up for in terms of the notional rent process and how that's working at the moment. And then we'll talk about something on the other side of things. For those of you, if you've got leased premises, you rent from a landlord, some of the processes and things to be aware of when you go through a rent review and a lease renewal for your leasehold premises as well. And then we'll talk about how to maximize your rental income. So some of the things that you can do to increase the rent that you're receiving from the ICBs and from the NHS. And then we'll finish that all off just with a free premises health check, something that we offer all our clients and all surgeries really across the UK, some of the free services that we can assist with, and some things that we may potentially be able to assist you with moving forward. Okay, so just very briefly in terms of who we are, just so you're aware that we know what we're talking about. We have dealt with practices within primary care for around 9 or 10 years now. Personally, I've got around 15 years experience assisting GP practices with a wide variety of premises related matters. So we do things like notional rent reviews, so in terms of maximising the rental income you receive from the NHS, lease rent reviews and lease renewals to make sure you're not paying your landlord too much, make sure you're not paying over the odds to the landlords of the practices. We do market valuation. So if you have like partnership changes, we can value the premises to determine what the value of a particular partner's share is in the premises, and then all the way through to sale and lease back. So if you're struggling with succession and retirement planning, we can potentially assist you with looking at selling the premises to an investor and potentially transferring the contract as well to other entities if required. So like I said, we've helped a number of practices, around 1,500 GP practices since we were launched in 2017. So around 5-10% of all practices in the UK we've acted for. We are #1 ranked specialist primary care surveying firm in the UK as well, with over 150 5-star reviews. It's actually all we do, so we don't work in any other sectors. We just solely deal with primary care, and we've got 8 specialist primary care surveyors here with over 100 years combined experience between the 8 surveyors with helping practices with the matters and the issues that we've just mentioned earlier. So we'd like to think that we're well placed to assist practices with any premises related matters, and we'd like to think we know what we're talking about as well, at least most of the time. Okay, so in terms of the presentation itself, the first slide is going to be about the changes that were made in the premises cost direction. So the original or the previous version of the premises cost directions, we were all working on the 2013 premises cost directions. And if you aren't 100% sure, so what the premises cost directions are, they're basically a set of directions that govern how your rent's going to be determined, how your lease reviews are going to be be determined. So anything to do with your premises are basically governed by these directions. They were, like I said, we were dealing with the 2013 directions, which were extremely out of date for a number of years. They finally came up with the new ones in May 2024, and I'm just going to highlight some of the major changes that were made and the differences between the two directions. So there is a change in a lease rent review process. So this is probably the biggest change over the premises cost directions. It's certainly affected the most number of practices, because if you're in a leasehold premises, the way in which the 2013 directions were effectively, you were just left out of the rent review process. So your landlord would instigate a rent review and then just negotiate directly with the ICB and the district valuer, and you had nothing to do with it. You were just, as long as you were getting fully reimbursed for the rent you paid the landlord, it didn't really matter about that negotiation. You'd just sit back and wait. And once those negotiations were concluded, you'd continue to get fully reimbursed, and everyone was happy. Someone in their wisdom decided that was a far too simple process and thought it needed to be complicated. So they added an extra layer of negotiations between the landlords and the practice. So now, rather than the landlord contacting the ICB and the district valuers directly, you as a practice now need to show that you have negotiated with the landlord initially. So you have to show that you have had some sort of discussion with the landlord to show and to make sure that what they're proposing is correct and in line with the current market. I guess the idea and the thought process from NHS England was that it would save a bit of time from the district valuer, and it would stop the landlords just proposing ludicrous rents. But what it does mean from your point of view as a practice is you now potentially have to instruct a surveying firm and pay for a surveying firm to have those initial discussions with the landlord. So it's just, if you're in a leasehold premises or you've got a practice that it has a landlord, when you have that rent review, just feel free to get in touch. We can review it. We can make sure that you have the necessary protections in the lease, and we can potentially assist you through the process if required, or really just hold your hand through the process. We have created a specific service for that, which is a very watered down service to hopefully not cost as much money as it would do if you were to fully instruct us. So, and I would say 50% of the time we're not even needed. So we can probably just give you some free initial advice to actually avoid us being needed at all. Because to be honest, although it's great because we get extra instructions, even we see it as a bit of a waste of time. We're just almost going through the motions, and it's just a tick box exercise, really. We're really not required at all. And if we can try and explain that to the ICB, perhaps just in an email, like I said, most of the time that avoids you actually having to instruct us. But the best advice I can say is when you receive your rent review notice from the landlord, if you're in a leasehold premises, just ping it over to a surveyor, even if it's not ourselves, just ping it over to a specialist surveyor who should be able to run you through the process and assist you with that if necessary. Okay, so another major change is the 12-week deadline. So rather than, we've just talked about when you're in a leasehold premises, if you're in an owner-occupied practice and you receive the notional rent assessment, when you receive that, there is now a statutory 12-week deadline to respond to that. So you have to either respond or either accept it or decline it within that 12-week period. There was some misinterpretation of the directions when they first came out, and I think a lot of people were thinking that meant you only had 12 weeks to instigate an appeal, and that is not the case. We have instigated several appeals outside of that 12-week window. I think what it actually is saying, the directions, is you have to respond within that 12-week period, otherwise it's deemed as automatic acceptance, which you can still challenge at a later date if needed, but it just enables the ICB almost to just get it off their desk and forget about it. It's just a time-saving exercise from their point of view. And what it means is, as well, is any backdated rent arrears won't actually be paid unless you respond within that period of time. So still very, very important that you keep to that 12-week deadline. It certainly makes the process of appealing far simpler if you do. But what I would say is if time has passed, 12 weeks goes in an instant sometimes, and it's hard to keep track of it. So if you're outside of that 12-week window, as long as you haven't physically responded to their proposal, then you should still be able to appeal. But like I said, if you can keep within that 12-week window, ultimately, as soon as you receive that notional rent assessment from the NHS, just send it off to your preferred surveyor, just to run checks to make sure you're not getting underfunded and things. Okay, so the next thing that's changed, one of the other things that's changed is the improvement grant funding cap has now been removed. So if you've ever applied for a grant or money, Section 186, whatever it may be, there used to be a cap on the grants that you could receive. So it was up to 66%. So if you had a project that you wanted to build an extension, or you wanted improvements and upgrades, you could only receive a grant up to 66% of the value of that extension. You actually had to self-fund the other 34%. Now that cap has been removed to enable the ICBs to actually provide 100% grants. What I would say is, just because they can provide 100% grants does not mean they are going to provide 100% grants. So it gives them the capability of doing it. It doesn't mean they're going to. So there's still major issues within ICBs in terms of general fundings. It can still be very, very difficult to get grant money, and you may find that they're still only willing to give you up to 50 or 60% grant funding, but it just enables them to give you 100% if required. So it's positive news, but in real life, I don't really think it's changed. I think we're aware of only a very small handful of practices who have actually been allowed to have 100% grants up and down the country. And the last change is to do with leases required if all partners have retired. So if you are in a practice and the premises is owned by ex-GP partners, and there's not a single partner that owns the premises that still holds the contract, still works at the practice, you are now required to put a lease in place. So you will have to go through the process of putting a lease in place. What I would say is, I think it's probably useful to consider putting a lease in place, even if there's just one ex-partner who is no longer a contract holder. If there's an unconnected party, so if there's a landlord who isn't a contract holder, or if there's a contract holder who isn't a landlord, you really want to be considering putting a lease in place at the moment, because the whole point of a lease is it avoids disputes. It avoids any disputes if, for instance, repairs and maintenance is needed at the premises. Now, if you require repair and maintenance and you've got someone who's just the premises owner and someone who's just a contract holder, you're going to have a difference on who is actually going to be responsible for the repairs and maintenance, whether it's going to be the landlord or whether it's going to be the tenant. So I would say, even if there's just one partner that no longer holds the contract, you might want to consider putting a lease in place. But you have to now, you are obliged and obligated to put a lease in place if all of the partners no longer work for the premises, no longer hold the practice, sorry. Okay, so that's the premises cost directions. There are actually a number of other changes that have gone on with the premises cost directions. We put a blog together, which is on our website 2 or 3 weeks after the premises cost directions came into effect, with a breakdown of all the changes. A lot of solicitors did similar things, a lot of the surveyors did similar things. So if you want to know some of the other changes, feel free to go on our website. But equally, if you just type into Google differences between the 2013 and the 2024 premises cost directions, you'll probably get a whole host of articles just outlining some of the other changes that may affect you moving forward. Okay, so moving on to the notional rent. So if you're in an owner-occupied premises, you'll obviously know what notional rent is. You'll receive notional rent. That'll be reviewed every 3 years. We assist a number of practices through that process. We do around 400 notional rent reviews annually up and down the country. And from our records, around 89% of practices in the UK are now getting underfunded for their notional rent. So that effectively is 89% of practices that we visit for notional rents aren't receiving the correct notional rent reimbursement. Now, that sometimes is only a couple of £100 wrong. Sometimes it can be tens of thousands of pounds. So there can be big differences in how underfunded you are. But around 9 out of 10 practices are underfunded. So if you're in a practice where you receive notional rent and you don't normally get a second opinion, I would say it is imperative that you get a second opinion, just to make sure what you're receiving is correct and in line with the current market. The notional rent process can be extremely lengthy. I think they're very, very far behind in undertaking their rent reviews. But there are things that you can do to kind of speed the process up. The first thing we tell all our clients is just try and stay on top of the ICB. Just send them regular chases, regular emails, reminding them that you are due a review. Yes, they will get round to it eventually. but if you leave it up to the ICB, it could take months and months because there's major staffing issues within the ICB, major staffing issues within the district valuer's office. So if you try and keep on top of them, they will probably bump you up the priority list. So just try and send them in regular chases to remind them that you're due. The first stage of the process is to request the CMR1 forms. What is one of our biggest gripes with the process is what happens is they'll send you CMR1 forms which kind of instigate the rent review process. So it's the Excel spreadsheet that asks you questions about what has changed since your last review. Now they're only every 3 years, but what they'll do is they'll send you a blank form every 3 years, even though technically 3 years prior you completed the form and submitted it. And what would be an easier way of doing it is if they just sent you the previously submitted forms, and then you can just update and amend them. It's a far quicker process. It's a relatively straightforward form, but it's just quite a time-consuming form to fill in. Whereas if they could send you the previously submitted form, you can update and amend it and send that off straight away. So that what I would say is that's the best thing to do is actually request a copy of the previously submitted forms. If you've got them and you hold them on file at the practice, brilliant, then just update and amend them and then just ping them off to the NHS, and you've done that stage of the process and skipped having to wait for the NHS to send you the CMR1 forms. But otherwise, if you don't hold a copy on file, just send them a quick email and just ask them for a copy of the previously submitted forms, and then just check the details are correct, check to make sure nothing's changed, and update any sections that need updating. So once you've filled in the forms, the district valuer will come out and visit the premises, and then the ICB will provide you with the district valuer's proposal. It is, like I said, very, very important that you don't just accept that initial proposal. That's all it is. It's an initial proposal of rent. You'll be given the opportunity to get a second opinion and to potentially challenge it. And that's your opportunity to contact companies like ourselves or other surveying firms just to make sure what has been proposed is correct in line with the current market. And we can actually do that for you free of charge. So if you send us through the CMR6 you receive, the district valuer's report, we can get one of our surveyors to check it free of charge just to make sure it's correct and in line with the current market. And then we can talk about the next stage of the process in terms of any potential challenges. And I'm sure a lot of other surveyors will do similar things as well. Also, just be aware of notional rent abatements. One of the biggest things we see when we're challenging notional rents is that the abatements that are assigned to the notional rent are sometimes incorrectly calculated. So an abatement would be put on your rent if, for instance, you built an extension or you had improvements and you received grant money for that part of the premises. So if you built an extension and you received a grant from the ICB to build that extension, what the ICB will do is, rather than pay you full notional rent for that, they'll say, look, we funded 50% of that extension, so we're only going to pay you rent for 50% of that extension. And they'll abate the rent, they'll reduce the rent for a period of time, and that's normally 5, 10, 15 years, depending on how much you actually received in grant money. But that is often calculated incorrectly. What is often missed is, if you received it, let's say just for easy maths, you received a 50% grant, you built an extension, that extension was worth £10,000 in notional rent, they would technically abate that by 50%. They would reduce it by 50% and only give you £5,000 rather than the full £10,000 for a period of time. But they should actually also give you an additional 10% on top of that. So they'd give you an additional 10%. And that's actually just because you're funding the repairs and maintenance that's needed on that extension for that period of time. So they should only abate it by the proportion that they funded, minus the 10% for your repairs and maintenance, and that is quite often missed. So again, just checking your abatement calculations is very, very important if you've ever had a grant or ever built an extension using monies external to the surgery. And if you are building an extension, you're thinking about building an extension, just always make sure that you seek approval from the NHS, from the ICB, not just to build the extension, but to receive reimbursement for that extension. Historically, we have had so many clients call us up to say, look, they got approval to build an extension from the ICB or the CCG or the PCT at the time. But they're not receiving notional rent for it, and that's because there's a two-tier approval system effectively with the ICB. So you don't just need to seek approval to build; you need to seek approval for reimbursement as well. And it's a little bit sneaky, I think, at times, where the ICB will say, "Yes, sure, build an extension." Practices just assume they're going to get reimbursement for it. And the ICBs will say, well, no, we said you could build the extension, we never agreed to pay you reimbursement for it. So very, very important that if you're contemplating making it improvements or certainly building an extension, that you seek approval for it. And again, a specialist primary care surveyor would be able to assist you through that process. Okay, so if you're in an owner-occupied practice as well, you're going through a notional rent review, things to think about in terms of how to maximize the value of that rental income. So the first thing is to get it checked, as I've said a couple of times already. Get your notional rent checked by an independent surveyor just to make sure that what you're receiving is correct and in line with the current market. But also check any other lease agreements that you have at the practice. If you rent out to a pharmacist or a dentist or district nurses, whatever it may be, if you have a lease in place with them, just have a look to see if you've got any outstanding rent reviews within the lease. And make sure that that lease hasn't expired, and instigate those rent reviews and just try and maximize the rent that you're receiving in general at the practice. Also make the most of any spare space or non-reimbursable areas. So perhaps you used to rent out to a dentist or a pharmacist and they have now vacated, and that area is just empty and you're not receiving reimbursement for it. Perhaps look at utilizing that for GMS purposes and then seeking approval from the ICB for reimbursement of that space as well. Or if you have additional space, maybe look at just trying to get another alternative therapist in to rent that space out to you as well. Upgrades, improvements, and extensions are always going to increase the value of the premises. They're always going to increase the rental income as long as you receive the necessary approvals from the ICB as well. Okay, so that was mainly for practices in owner-occupied premises. If we look at some information for those practices that are in leasehold premises, so specifically when you're looking at putting a lease in place, if you have an existing lease, there are a few health warnings for both tenants and landlords to consider. So the biggest thing, again, that we see in leasehold premises is that leases just aren't specific to NHS. They aren't specific to primary care. So if you've just gone and got a commercial lease off the internet, you've only got two entities to worry about. You've got the landlord and the tenant. In primary care, when it's a GP surgery lease, there's actually a third entity. It's the ICB, the NHS, who play quite a significant role in things like the rent reviews and the lease renewals. And if their role isn't stipulated within that lease, it can be quite difficult to instigate rent reviews and go through a lease renewal. So very, very important that you have a specific NHS GP surgery lease. And very, very important that when you go through a lease renewal or when you're putting a lease in place, again, that you get approval from the NHS and the district valuers, because effectively the NHS are agreeing to reimburse you for the rent that you're paying the landlord. So they just need to make sure it's good value for money for them. So before you sign and agree to anything that the landlord proposes, just make sure that A, you run it through by a surveyor, but equally and probably more important that you run it by the ICB just to make sure they are happy with the terms within the lease. And some of the things that they will check are things like whether you have the necessary protections in the lease. So you should really, when you're in a GP surgery lease, you should have a clause that says the rent you pay the landlord does not exceed what you're getting reimbursed by the NHS. So effectively what it means is for the duration of the lease, you're always going to get reimbursed for the rent that you pay the landlord. So very, very important that you have the necessary protections. Potentially also that you're protected at the end of the lease to allow you to automatically renew the lease to stop the landlord from being able to just kick you out and getting another tenant in. You should be protected under the Landlord and Tenants Act to make sure, or at least make it very difficult for the landlord to just kick you out, which means you can just renew at the end of the lease very easily. You also want to probably be checking your obligations, so your repair and maintenance obligations. You'll have two main options. You can either just be responsible for the internal repair, or you can be responsible for the internal and the external repair. So if you're responsible for the internal repair, that means effectively the landlord takes on the responsibility of the external repair. That is probably the default mechanism, the default process where the landlord takes on responsibility for the external and you as tenants are responsible for the internal. Now, quite often landlords don't want to take on that responsibility. They don't want to have to worry about any repairs and maintenance that's needed through the duration of the lease, and they'll try and bat that responsibility back to the practices. If that is the case and you're in a leasehold premises and you're responsible for all the repairs and maintenance that's needed, then you can actually retain a proportion of the rent that you receive from the ICB. So you can retain somewhere between 5 and 7.5% of the rent. And the idea is you use that money, you put it into a sinking fund, and you use that money to fund any repairs and maintenance that's needed for the external part of the building. So either A, the landlord takes on the responsibility, or B, you have the responsibility, but you should have that money in a sinking fund to cover the cost. So it shouldn't be costing you financially to be responsible. So it might be worthwhile just checking what your repair and maintenance obligations are, and just checking to ensure that you are actually receiving the necessary retentions from the ICB, and you have the money stored away if anything's needed. The last point is perhaps if you're in a leasehold premises, just to consider a lease re-gear prior to the expiry of the lease. So if you've got 5 or 6 years to run on a long-term lease, it might be a good opportunity to contact the landlord and see if they would consider a lease re-gear, which is similar to a lease renewal. It's effectively renewing the lease early, but it'll just mean you'll be extending the lease effectively. But the benefit to you as a practice in doing that is quite often landlords are very happy to perhaps pay you to renew the lease early. They may be willing to build you an extension or pay for any upgrades and improvements if you are willing to sign up to a long-term lease, because there is a huge capital value in a long-term lease. So as that lease draws to a close, the value of the premises from the landlord's perspective is diminishing. It's worth less and less. Whereas if they can sign you up to a long-term lease, it's going to potentially increase the value of the premises quite often by hundreds of thousands of pounds, which is why they'd potentially contemplate building you an extension, because it's worth it financially for them. Now, they're not obligated to say yes, but it's just if you are within that period, and the best time to do it is probably 3 to 6 years prior to the expiry of the lease. Perhaps it might be worthwhile just entering negotiations. If you're running out of space and you need an extension, you need upgrades and improvements, it might be a really good opportunity to perhaps negotiate with the landlord and see if they can fund some of those for you. Okay, so that is just about it, to be honest with you. I'll just run through a free premises health check that we do. So we effectively offer free consultations to all GP practice staff. So if you've got a question about your premises, you want it answering, we're more than happy to just have a conversation with you, see if we can resolve it over the phone, or see if we can perhaps take it further and assist you moving forward with anything to do with your premises. We offer free notional rent reimbursement assessments. So again, if you've got a historic notional rent review or you're due a notional rent review soon, feel free to send it over to us. We'll review it, make sure it's correct, make sure you're not getting underfunded. We can check the abatement calculation on there as well, make sure that's been abated correctly. Or if you're in a leasehold premises, we can check your GP surgery lease. So we can check what your repair and maintenance obligations are. We can check to make sure you're receiving the correct retentions. We can check to make sure you've got the necessary protections within the lease as well. And we can do that for you free of charge. All we need is a copy of the lease, and we can send that through. We used to do that manually. So our surveyors just used to read the lease, probably took about an hour to go through the lease and pick out all the relevant sections. But with modern technology, AI now does that in about 30 seconds. So we just pop it into a little system, and AI will just give us all the necessary information with it within seconds. So it's a very, very easy process now. So yeah, just feel free to send it over. We can do that for you free of charge, no problem at all. And the same for your pharmacy lease as well. Or if you rent any space out to anybody else at the practice, a dentist, whatever it may be, send through the lease. We can advise on when your next rent reviews are due and when your next lease renewal is due. And again, we can do that all free of charge as well. So yeah, that is pretty much it for me. All I would say as a final thoughts is whatever you're doing, whatever you're going through at the practice from a premises perspective, whether it's a rent review or a lease renewal, or you're contemplating building an extension and upgrades and improvements, or going through a market valuation, whatever it is, just make sure that you use specialist organizations, specialist surveyors, specialist accountants, specialist solicitors. We are obviously one of those organizations, but there are several other specialist surveyors. There are around 70 specialist accountants, and again, there are probably between 5 and 10 specialist solicitors as well. If you don't know any, then feel free to give us a call. Perhaps you don't need surveying advice, perhaps you need legal advice or accountancy advice, but you don't know where to turn. Feel free to give us a call. We've got a vast network of experts, and not just solicitors or accountants, but architects, building surveyors, whatever it may be. We can always pass on contact details of trusted organisations that we've worked with in the past and that we know have assisted a number of our clients. Okay, that's it. There's my contact details. So if you do want to get in touch, my direct line's there. That's my email address, and the company website. If you want to go on, there's a contact us page on our company website. There's also a whole host of videos that we've put on, vlogs and blogs, loads of information on there that's obviously free of charge to access. And yeah, like I said, give us a call at any point if you want to talk about anything specific about your surgeries.